Welcome to today's workshop on Equity 101 offered by our partner, Carta. My name is John Wensveen. I'm the Chief Innovation Officer at Nova Southeastern University and Executive Director of the Alan B. Levan NSU Broward Center of Innovation. Before we begin the workshop, I would like to take an opportunity to provide an overview of the Alan B. Levan NSU Broward Center of Innovation. The Levan Center is a public-private partnership between Nova Southeastern University and Broward County. We are building an economic and education development engine for Greater Fort Lauderdale, Broward County, and South Florida with local, regional, national, and international impact. We offer customized programs, events, and wraparound services to support the founder's journey from birth of an idea through to successful exit of a company. Our three themes include innovation, technology, and entrepreneurship. Our four pillars are ideate, incubate, accelerate, and post-accelerate. Our six outcomes include breakthrough ideation, new technologies, talent skills pipelines, new jobs, company formation, and the scaling of early stage and young startup companies. Our 54,000 square foot facility in Fort Lauderdale is under construction, and we will open in summer of 2021. As we develop our partnerships, it is important for the Levan Center to offer resources to support each stage of the founder's journey. We are excited to partner with Carta to offer education and information about founders managing capital. Founders face a range of decisions when building their startups, including market and production decisions, financing, as well as accessing top talent and a co-founder. As a startup grows and matures, we usually see founders focusing on product and revenue structures. However, it is equally important to structure their own founding teams. According to the Harvard Business Review, one of those important pitfalls includes founder equity splits. For example, the way founders distribute ownership to themselves when starting their business. Last year, TechCrunch shared that many startup founders struggle with how much equity to give away at each stage of the startup growth cycle. In many cases, they end up giving up too much equity at an early stage of the company in return for little capital. As we position the Levan Center as a valuable resource for the startup community here in South Florida, we are excited to be offering this workshop powered by Carta, Equity 101, Funding Your Startup. It gives me great pleasure to welcome Rachel Alexander, Head of Accelerator Development, and Kelley, Oreglia, Director of Business Development, who will lead today's workshop, Equity 101, Funding Your Startup, with the underlying message on the importance of a well-managed cap table. Welcome, Rachel and Kelley. I will hand the reins over to you.
Thanks, John. I will go ahead and share my screen here. So just to kick things off, thank you so much for having us. We're so excited to be here today. This presentation is really centered around giving you some basic information about your cap table, why it's important, how you should set it up, and then towards the end, we're looking at some examples and tools that are available to help you get your cap table started right from day one of your company. Before I jump into things, I do have to read a quick word from Carta's lawyers. So I'm going to read that, and then I'm going to jump into the presentation. All right. This communication is on behalf of eShares Inc., DBA Carta Inc. This communication is not to be construed as legal, financial, or tax advice and is for informational purposes only. The communication is not intended as a recommendation, offer, or solicitation for the purchase or sale of any security. Although this presentation may provide information concerning potential legal issues, it is not a substitute for legal advice, and any opinions or conclusions provided in this presentation shall not be ascribed to Carta. Carta does not assume any liability for reliance on the information provided herein. All right. So here's a quick look at the agenda. The first part of this presentation is really centered around cap table basics, key terms to know, why is your cap table important. The second part of the presentation is examples of how cap tables are built, and again, tools that you can use to help build your cap table right from day one. We'll likely have time for questions and answers at the end. If you do have a question, feel free to type it into the chat box. Rachel's going to keep an eye on that for me. And I think John's going to help us run the Q&A after the presentation. So first question, what is a cap table? So your cap table is essentially the investing story of your company, right? All the different equity structures, so your preferred shares, your common shares, your option pool, and who owns what in the company, right? And, when you start, it's going to be very simple. Maybe yourself, a co-founder, a consultant you bring on early, a safe note that you do really early on. And then it'll grow. You'll have your Series A, Series B. It gets much more complex. And because of that complexity, small errors in your cap table will compound as the cap table grows. And that's why it's so important to make sure that your cap table is super accurate and well maintained from the early days of your startup. And let's start with an uncomfortable fact. Most cap tables are wrong. So at Carta, we look at thousands of cap tables, hundreds of new companies onboarding every month. And our onboarding team will tell you that most of the cap tables they see are inaccurate. And a lot of times those are really small discrepancies with what's been issued to an employee and what's on the cap table, or a vesting schedule's off by a few days. And those are really easily fixed. And sometimes it's larger errors, like something being issued out twice and needing to be retracted, or numbers being off. And you have to dig through that equity data to figure out why things aren't matching up, which can be really time consuming and expensive for startups that are later stage and have more complex cap tables. So again, what we're hoping to do today is help you avoid some of those mistakes and set your cap table up so that you have an easier time with hiring and finding investors and speaking to your own company's equity story. So why is your cap table important? So going over these, I think number 1, 3, and 4 you're looking at all kind of have to do with your investors, right? So first is it helps you raise money. If you can tell your company's equity story to an investor, they're going to be more ready to hand over the financing that you need, right? And the second part of that, number 2, is retaining and hiring employees. Early stage startups, a big part of your recruiting is going to be issuing equity to potential employees. So making sure you understand that you've allocated enough to your option pool and that you can communicate to potential hires what they're being issued and what the value of that is. It's going to be an important way for you to recruit really good talent to your startup when you're cash strapped, right, in those early stages. 3 and 4, again, it's talking to your investors, talking to your employees, being able to communicate the equity story of your company and present that really cleanly to potential investors. And 5, I kind of touched on already. As your company grows, your cap table is going to get more complex. So it's really important to start with that day one mentality of setting up your cap table correctly and really paying attention to those details as your company grows. And last, it's a central repository. As your company grows, there's going to be more people involved in the management of your equity and your cap table, right? At the beginning, it may just be you maintaining your cap table. And then at some point, you'll bring in a law firm, at some point, maybe an accounting firm. And you want all of those people looking at the same information. You don't want multiple copies of your cap table floating around that may have discrepancies. So making sure you know what the most accurate copy of your cap table is important. All right, so the next few slides are key terms to know. It's like 4 slides. We're going to go through some kind of cap table adjacent terms that you should be aware of when you're thinking about your cap table. So first is common and preferred stock. So cap tables have different share classes. Common is what's typically issued to founders and employees. It is paid out after preferred shares. There's no voting rights with common shares. Preferred is what's issued to your investors. So you'll have your preferred Series A, your preferred Series B, and then you'll have your common class, which has all the employees that have exercised options in there. Your pre and post money valuation, it's pretty self-explanatory. It's what is the value of the company before financing round? And then the value after is that pre-money valuation plus the cash that was raised in that financing round. Let's dive into option grants really quick. So when you are issuing an option to an employee, you're not giving them shares in your company, you're giving them the option to buy shares. And the benefit of an option grant is that you issue it on the grant date. The employee buys the shares at the price of the share on the day that the option was granted, which for startups can mean a lot of added value if the employee's been there for several years, right? If they join the company really early on and the company's not worth any money, and now you've gone through financing events and you've built product and the company's worth a lot of money, the employee's still paying the price for that share that it was issued on, the grant date. So the first stage is a grant. That's the day that the employee receives the option. The second and the third, the cliff and the fully vested, have to do with the vesting schedule. Most commonly, we see a 4-year vesting schedule with a 1-year cliff. That's our most common vesting schedule. But you can do all sorts of different vesting schedules. You can also do milestone-based vesting schedules, which is more common with contractors, where you are issuing equity based on the completion of a project. So you can do both time, milestone-based vesting. A 4-year vesting schedule with a 1-year cliff means the employee starts on January 1st, 2021. Their cliff ends on January 1st, 2022. The reason you do that is you don't want to issue 1,000 options to an employee, have them show up on their first day of work, and then quit on day 2 and be able to take those shares of your company with them without contributing to the success of your company. So what you're saying is, we're going to give you these options, but you need to stay at the company for a year before you have access to any of them. So after that first year, they'll get a quarter of their total option grant. And then over the next 3 years, it'll vest monthly until after the end of the 4th year, they have access to 100% of what was granted to them on their start date, on that grant date. So for exercise, so an exercise means that the employee is exercising their right to buy the shares in the company. So they're taking that option and they're saying, yeah, I want to use my option to buy my shares. You can either do that early exercise or exercise after vest. Early exercise just means they're exercising the option before it's fully vested. And that's totally up to the company and how you want to structure your equity plan. Once they've exercised their options, the last step is the sale. And for private companies, that really depends on the company having some sort of event that allows the employee to sell their shares in the company. That can be a liquidity event, so some sort of a structured event the company runs that allows either existing investors or new investors to come in and buy shares from employees. It can be a merger, an acquisition, an IPO process, some event that allows the employee to sell those shares. And that's a full cycle of an employee option grant. And it's really important to understand these terms because you're going to be the one explaining that to employees that you hire and issue equity to. And you want to make sure that they understand the value of those shares in the company that they're getting options to. Price per share is the price per share in the company. So it's the pre-money valuation divided by the fully diluted cap table. To jump down to fully diluted capitalization, that is the entire equity in the company. So your cap table will have everything that's been issued out, right? So all the employees that have been issued options, all the investors that have been issued shares. A fully diluted capitalization also includes what has not been issued out. So any shares that have not been issued yet, any options in the option pool that have not been issued yet, that's your fully diluted capitalization. Your stock plan allocation is what have you allocated for your option pool. So you need to set those shares aside before you start issuing equity to employees and make sure you actually have the shares to back up those option grants. 409A valuation. So we talked about pre and post money valuation. A 409A valuation is when a third party firm comes in and validates the value of the company. And the reason for that is obviously as the company, you are biased towards the value of the company. So what they do is say, you need to have a third party come in and set the fair market value for the shares. And that's really something to protect employees to make sure they're not being issued options that are over or undervalued. And if you are a C corporation and you're issuing option grants, you are required to have a 409A either every 12 months or every time the company goes through a material change, which could be a financing event, an FDA approval, anything that's going to materially change the value of the company. Carta does hundreds of valuations a month. We've seen all sorts of different kinds of companies, pre-revenue companies, companies that have entirely new products. Our team has ways of valuing all sorts of different companies. So if you have questions on that, you can always reach out to Carta. But you want to make sure that you're either talking to your legal counsel or your peers and making sure that if you're issuing option grants and you are a C Corp, that you know if you need to have a 409A evaluation done or not. Ownership percentage, pretty straightforward. It's what percentage of the company do you own? And then notes and safes are a type of a way of taking on financing without issuing the stocks right or the shares right away to your investors. So what you're saying is you need that financing and you're going to convert that SAFE into a share upon the first actual financing round. And we'll talk about notes and SAFEs a bit later. We see them very, very commonly with early stage startups. And the most important thing to know with SAFE notes is that you really need to understand that conversion rate. What is the SAFE note going to convert to in shares upon that financing event? Make sure that you're not over diluting the company, because that can impact how much of the company you as a founder have. And we'll talk about that a bit later. Okay, so now that we've done key terms, we're going to do a couple common questions that we get from early stage founders. So what if I have no plans to take on investors? Do I still need a cap table? Obviously at Carta, we love cap tables. We're a little biased, so we're gonna say yes, you do. We also have reasons as to why you need a cap table. The first is to clarify your ownership to your business partners, right? When we talk about co-founders, a lot of times you'll see like some back of the napkin agreement about the split in equity. You really wanna make sure that that is documented. You have the legal documentation, you've talked to your co-founder, you understand what that equity split is going to be. And so the top reason, even if you're not taking on investors, is that you and your business partners understand ownership in the company, even just between yourselves. The second is incentivize current and prospective employees. You can still issue equity to your employees, even if you never plan on taking on investments from investors. And it can be a really, really great recruiting tool. So making sure you have a cap table allows you to choose to issue equity to employees at some point. You're leaving that door open. 3 is just preserve optionality, right? And being prepared for M&A opportunities, right? If you have your cap table and it's set somewhere, you're leaving the option open for all of these possibilities. Our company is a 2-pizza team. Who is responsible for the cap table? So the answer to that is it's going to change at different stages of your company. When you start and it's just you and your co-founder and maybe a consultant you've brought on, you can manage the cap table on your own, whether you're using a software like Carta or an Excel spreadsheet. With some, work with a legal consultant, you can manage that cap table. So early stage, it's usually the founder and some outside counsel help. Once you start raising your Series A, your Series B, you'll have a head of finance and ops that's most likely working with your law firm to maintain the cap table. Series C plus, CFO, you have an internal general counsel, and then enterprise, again, CFO, general counsel. So it's going to change, but as early stage, the founder is really responsible. Even if you are using a law firm, at the end of the day, you're the one that's communicating to employees, to potential investors, and so you need to make sure that your cap table is accurate. For taking the lean approach, what are the costs of keeping a clean cap table? So that's really up to you. Again, at the end of this presentation, the second half, we're going to look at examples of cap tables and then tools that are available to help you build your cap table. And so you can take a few different approaches, right? So with Carta, right, it costs money, but the flip side of that is you're getting a really structured cap table. You can use Excel, which is free. The flip side of that is it's very easy to have manual data entry errors in that. But I think the thing to think about more is not the direct cost of the actual cap table, but the potential cost of fixing an error down the line. And that's where Carta takes this day one approach. We've seen a lot of cap tables come in where the company is ready to do their Series A or their Series B, and they haven't updated their cap table for several months. And now they're working with their law firm, which costs them money to go back and update every option grant that's been issued out. Any sort of change on the cap table has to then be manually updated. So, and if there's an error, that can even accrue more time and cost to get it fixed. So what we always say is take a day one approach. Think about setting up the lifetime cycle of your cap table and your equity. So it's hard to put a dollar amount on that, but there's a lot of options out there and you have to weigh the pros and cons of all of them, including the cost. This is the one plug I'll make on Carta. We do have a free option for early stage companies that have raised less than $1 million and under 25 equity holders. And we have a special link for NSU. It's up here on this. And I believe the NSU team has this link as well that they'll be sharing. But this is a great way to get started on Carta. It gives you all of the cap table tools that you need to just get your cap table set up and rolling. All right, so let's look at some examples of cap tables. So I mentioned this one before. It's our company A. It's the back of the napkin example. So in this one, you see $100,000 for 5% of XYZ Corp. And Reed and Jack have signed the napkin. This is not a legal document, would be the biggest problem with it. So what you would want to do if you're sitting at home and you have a back of the napkin cap table, you probably want to find some legal counsel and get some legal documents behind that, and then get your cap table into a structured situation. The problem with this obviously is this napkin can get lost. You can spill water on it. It's not a very secure way to be dealing with the equity of your company. Company B is the dilution example. So this is what I was talking about with safe notes and understanding how that dilution is going to impact the company upon the conversion of that safe note. You really want to understand how that safe note is structured, and when that financing event happens, exactly how many shares are going to be issued to that note holder and how that's going to impact the rest of the equity in the company. There's a lot of tools online to help with this. Again, we always recommend talking to your legal counsel. Carta does have a safe and note calculator. It's at safes.carta.com. You can plug in the terms of your safe note and it'll help you calculate out what that conversion is going to look like. The next is an Excel cap table, find the heir. So you can see the total authorized shares in this company is 10,000 shares, but the total that's been issued out is over 10,000. So that would be you're over allocating shares that you even have available to issue out. And that's an example of one of the errors that we see when we're looking at Excels. They're not usually as blatant as this one. It can be small. It can be off by 1 or 2 on a few different line items. But when you add up, if you have 100 share or stakeholders in your company and a couple of them are off, that's going to add up at the end. All right, time to build. So this is the last section of the presentation, and this is where we look at the tools that are available to you to get your cap table started. So whether you are very, very early stage, you haven't really thought about your cap table yet, and you're looking at options, or you already have a cap table, but you want to know what else is available or what the next step of your cap table's life cycle is, we're going to go over some of the tools and options that are available for you. So the first thing is to work backwards. You want to make sure that you have all the documents that you need in order to create your cap table, right? So the first step, again, is finalizing your understanding with your co-founders. How much of the company do you own? How much of the company do they own? Your incorporation documents, right? Your certificate of incorporation, your articles of organization, etc. Sorry, excuse me. Your stock purchase agreements, your stock plan documents. So once you have your option pool allocated, you need to have the documents so that you can actually issue that equity to your employees, any convertibles you've issued, and any relevant board actions. So the first step is to collect all of these documents. Sorry. Okay, so one is build from scratch. So the pros of building from scratch is you can really build to your specifications from the start. The con of this is it's hard to collaborate on and to maintain the cap table in Excel. So when we've seen founders get really creative with their equity, the challenge that you run into is how do I tell this equity story to investors and employees in a way that they can compare that to other companies they're looking at? Sorry, I talked too long. I get a itchy throat. So if you have an employee or a potential employee that's talking with 3 different startups, and the other 2 startups are issuing very common like ISOs, 4-year vesting schedule, and you're offering something really unique and different, you may think of that as a value add, but that employee's going to have a really hard time comparing that equity structure with what they're getting from the other 2 companies. So I would just be mindful of that. And what we typically tell startups is if you can't tell an investor or an employee what your equity story or your company's cap table story quickly and cleanly, it's probably too complex. Simpler is always better. So this is what a spreadsheet cap table may look like. Again, you can set it up however you want, start from total scratch, but it'll look something like this. The next is to use a template. This is like one step up from creating your own cap table. There are a ton of templates available online. Carta has a free cap table template in our founder toolkit. Again, it's much faster to set up if you're not starting from scratch, but it has the same issues as Accelerate. A lot of room for error, easy to make mistakes. And when I was talking earlier about different parties being involved in your cap table management, if you have a law firm and you have an Excel doc and they have one and you have another copy and those don't match up, you now have discrepancy in your cap table, which can happen with Excel as well. This is Carta's template. Again, if you just Google free cap table template, you'll see a lot of options. So if you are going to go the route where you're going to build your cap table in Excel, I would definitely recommend going with a template over just creating one from scratch yourself. The third option is cap table software. Obviously, Carta, we're biased to option 3. This is what Carta is. We are cap table software. It is the easiest way to get your cap table set up and updated. The only con of that is it costs money, like we discussed before. And with that, I'll wrap things up with the first year discount. So we do have a couple of deals for NSU. I believe the NSU team has the information on this and we'll be sending it out to folks. But you can visit this link if you do qualify for launch, or you can email Rachel and I at partners@carta.com to access either of these deals. And the last thing I'll mention before we jump into Q&A is just the Carta resources. We have a ton of great resources for founders on our website. We have all of these Equity 101s, key terms, things to know are on our support site. We also have a founder toolkit that includes the cap table template and a few other tools that are helpful to early stage founders that are just getting set up. The safe and note calculator is great, whether you already have a safe note or you're looking to add one to your cap table. It's a great tool to go in and make sure you understand. And then we do have our Carta Startup Stack, which includes AWS credits. You can check that out. We work with a ton of other great service providers to offer perks to founders. Whether you're a Carta customer or not, on some of those, you can still take advantage of them. And with that, Rachel, did we get any questions in the chat? Or John, do you want to open things up to Q&A?
Yeah, so I do have some questions that have come through and have some of my own as well. And I appreciate the napkin example. So my background is in the airline business. I have a huge passion for the startup world with air carriers around the world. And it's interesting that Southwest Airlines, probably the most famous story of a successful startup, started on the back of a napkin with the initial co-founders. And I've always appreciated that story and learned a lot of lessons that that's just not the right way to do things as you move forward. But I have some questions that I'd like to pose to you, and they're somewhat generic in approach, so feel free to answer the way that you're most comfortable. But I've been an entrepreneur myself, and I've had a number of challenges along the way, and some successes and some failures, and one very big success. But one of the things that I realized as I matured as an entrepreneur is that I was very focused on my entry strategy, or the people that were around me very much focused on entry strategy when we were starting our initial businesses. And as I look longer into my career, I started to focus more on exit strategy. And I'm curious that if I'm an entrepreneur and I'm very focused on my entry strategy, when do you think about exit strategy? Should that be at the beginning of when you're starting your company? And how does this relate in terms of equity longer term? So I'm trying to plan ahead, knowing that I'm really concerned about keeping the lights on today, but at the same time, where am I going long term? And how does this equity discussion relate to that exit strategy?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'll use an example from, I believe it was Uber. When they were prepping for their IPO, they had to take a full page ad out in the New York Times saying, if you have shares in Uber, please let us know. And I think that is a great example of a company that didn't have a great cap table. Obviously a good company otherwise, but I use that example because I think it really cleanly paints a picture of what happens when you're not thinking about the exit strategy from day one. And like I said, your cap table is compounding, right? So anything that you do today is going to be on your cap table after your Series A, after your Series B, after your Series C. When you start to get to the point where you're thinking about that exit strategy, what you don't want to happen at that point is to have to call your law firm and say, we need to go through 10 years of equity data to figure out exactly who owns what before we go through the IPO process or an M&A process, right? And I think something that early stage founders don't know is there's a really, really thorough due diligence process that companies go through when they're prepping for exit events. And it's a process of going through the company's financials, their cap tables, everything, and making sure everything is really buttoned up before they go through that process. And so, when your cap table is super clean and you know exactly where everything is and who owns what, and you know it's accurate, it's going to save you so much time and so much money down the road. So even if you're like, I'm 90% entry strategy right now and 10% exit strategy, as long as you are thinking about that 10% even from day one, you're going to save yourself time and money down the line, right? And that's the ultimate goal of every startup, right? You will at some point need to be thinking about your exit strategy. And so it's one of those things, if you're pushing things under the rug, they will come back at some point. So I would say that's what we see most commonly is companies that have really managed their cap table well have a much easier time with that process.
And I appreciate that response. And I know the names like Google and Facebook, Microsoft, Amazon, you mentioned Uber, they come up all the time by entrepreneurs, especially in the technology sector. And that's my aspiration. That's what I want to be. And we also know it's the few and far between that make it to that level. But I know that one of the questions that came through earlier to me was around the subject of dynamic equity, and those types of organizations, I'm told, are successful using dynamic equity models, and maybe the terminology changes in different parts of the world. But is that something that you're familiar with or could expand upon what that means?
I haven't heard that term before, dynamic equity structures.
In some cases, it's restricted stock units, maybe another terminology.
Yeah. RSUs. So we typically see companies start issuing RSUs when they're later stage, a bit more mature. It is a good strategy. I wouldn't get too much into the detail of exactly when. I think that the easiest equity to issue at the beginning is probably more typical ISO, NSO, but it's really up to the company. And what we always say is talk to your legal counsel and talk to your peers about that. Carta tries to avoid, because we're a software platform, right? We're not a CPA firm or an equity service provider. We're just the software layer behind it. We try to avoid giving direct equity advice, but we do see RSUs in later stage companies.
And so that's interesting too. When you talk about legal counsel, and I know for a fact that we have a number of lawyers that are actually listening to the workshop here today that are very much focused on entrepreneurship. As an entrepreneur, do you have any guidance or recommendations in terms of how I identify the right legal representative or firm for what I'm going to be able to do?
Yeah. So I would say majority, probably like 95% of Carta's customers have their law firm on their Carta account. Law firms are power users. They're the ones going in and drafting option grants, issuing option grants, drafting board resolutions, etc. We get that question from early stage founders all the time. They'll actually come to us and ask us, do you have a law firm that you work with or has a lot of clients already on Carta in my area? And we can make that recommendation. So I would say, look at the tools you're using. Are any of the software services that you're using working with a lot of startups and can make a recommendation for you? Ask your peers. Make sure that law firm has a technology practice. They have other startup clients. You're not their only startup client, would be my recommendation, and ask your peers, right? There's so many great startup lawyers out there, and we always recommend that it's better to work with your legal counsel than to try to do it on your own, because it's like anything else on your cap table. If you don't set it up right, it's going to end up costing you more money down the line.
Great, and I appreciate that answer as well. And I know that launching a business and scaling a business has its own set of challenges, and there's a lot of complications that occur along the way. And then when you add in the international arena, it may complicate things even further. So my question is, if I'm starting a company or I'm a young startup and I'm starting to scale and I'm now bringing on employees in different countries around the world, how does this organizational framework impact the equity discussion, or does it at all?
It does, right? So there's going to be different tax implications for that employee. There's going to be, it does get a bit more complex. So if you're hiring employees internationally, I would definitely say get a law firm that has an international presence and they're familiar with that. We'll see companies set up different option agreements for their international employees. You want to understand what the local jurisdiction is for that employee. If you're using a software like Carta, are they going to have any issues with accepting that electronic option grant? How are they going to exercise, right? So your domestic employees may be able to exercise online. You may have to have a different process for your international employees. But a lot of companies have international employees these days. It's not a huge lift to be able to issue equity to them. And we really, because our kind of motto as a company is to create more owners, we definitely always want to see all employees be getting equity, whether they're US based or international.
So a scenario was just dropped into the chat box, and I'll just try to paraphrase and take it in a slightly different direction. But as a company starting out or growing, and we don't know what the future looks like in terms of our success. We're going to be wildly successful, moderately successful, maybe not so successful. If you think about the percentage of allocation of equity to those employees at the early stages, and all of a sudden my company's not doing so well, is there a negative impact there, or my company's doing really well? Does that also impact the agreements that I already have in place, or am I in a position, I guess is what I'm really trying to say, to renegotiate the terms of that? Or is that something that we need to think about at the very early stage when we're actually putting the content of agreements together?
So again, I'm not a lawyer, so I wouldn't be able to talk on the legality of renegotiating an option grant. The impact on your employee, right, is really not until they exercise. If they have options in the company and the company is doing really well or not so well, the employee hasn't paid for those options yet. So there's really no material impact to the employee until they actually exercise the option. I think, a negative impact obviously would be the employee exercises at a higher value than what the company's current value is, and now the employee is not making money on those options, right? The flip side of that, which is the scenario that startups are aiming for, is that the employees gained value, and the impact for the employee on that end is just tax implications, right? So a big part of issuing equity to employees is equity education for your employees, and making sure they know if you're offering early exercise, do they know that they need to send in an 83B? How does the tax impact them? And that's what you would think about if your company is doing really, really well, and all of a sudden all your employees have this, value in the company, and they're trying to figure out, should I exercise? How much is it going to cost me? What are my taxes going to be? And then upon some sort of sale event too, those questions come up, and being able to talk to your employees about the impact of that. But as far as renegotiating an existing option or grant that's been issued, I am not personally familiar with companies that are renegotiating an existing agreement. You can change the type of equity you're issuing and the option agreements. Companies very rarely will be issuing the same exact option documents from day one to, day 5 years down the line. Maybe you're switching from an ISO to an RSU. That's fine, but you're not changing what's existing. You're changing what's now being issued out to new employees, or new option grants to existing employees. But that's a really important question to think about, right? Because when we think about our cap tables, and you're thinking about, okay, how much of this equity do I want to set aside for my option plan? You want to make sure you're setting aside enough that you're not going to run out, and that you have enough in there to back up all of the option grants you've issued out. And so in that sense, it is important to sit down and make sure you really understand that allocation, what you're putting in there and what you're issuing out of it.
I've seen a lot of examples where there's too much given away too early, and then of course there were consequences later on. So being able to look at the future, although I know it's impossible to look at the future, but plan in the best way possible and be flexible in terms of how you structure everything, I think is really important. Which brings me into another question, and I think you touched on this already in your presentation, but from your perspective, what is the most common mistake that CARTA has seen amongst founders when structuring their cap tables?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I touched on this a bit. I think the most common mistake we see is really with not understanding the conversion of safe notes and how that's going to dilute the cap table once the financing event happens. So I did touch on that, but if you're going to do a convertible note, a warrant, a safe note, just make sure that you understand how it's structured. There are, those free safe note documents online that you can just grab off the internet and set up a safe note. But you should read those documents and make sure you understand them. Use a safe note calculator to understand the dilution impact of that safe note. It's a great tool for early stage founders, and I'm not, recommending that founders don't, do a safe note. But what we recommend is that you really understand it. And then outside of that, it's really just being super diligent about their cap tables. So a lot of companies, if they're not going on to the launch program, which is, free from day one, and then their cap table is just always on CARTA, I would say the next biggest group that's joining CARTA is like right before their Series A. And so they're like, I know I'm going to need a 409A. I know I'm going to hire a bunch of employees once I have this new capital. So I'm going to get my cap table on CARTA so that when that financing comes in, I can get my 409A, I can issue my option grants, and it's all cleaned up. And so our onboarding team is seeing those cap tables come in with whatever's happened, whether it's a seed round, a safe note, consultants, early employees that happened from day one to pre-Series A. And there can be information missing. So, I issued equity to this employee and then they left, and I think they exercised some, but it never made it onto the cap table. So now you're tracking down an individual that's not even at the company anymore. So I would say the two things to kind of be mindful of in the early stages are making sure you understand what you're issuing out and what the dilution is going to be to the company, and just, again, being super diligent on the details and making sure that those, back the napkin agreements make it onto the cap table.
So there's another question that's been posed, and I'll try to lay a little bit of framework with it. Often when a young company is starting out, hypothetically, two friends come together, and because they're friends, they try to split the company 50-50. And I've seen this before, and I don't know if you're able to comment or provide any guidance or advice here when those scenarios arise. Is that the best approach, or is there a different way that should be looked at?
Yeah. Founders come together under a lot of different circumstances. Sometimes you have a technical founder and a business founder that didn't know each other before the company started, but the technical founder knew they needed somebody that knew how to run a business, and they brought somebody on that could help them do that. Sometimes it is two friends. And so it's not always 50-50. CARTA is working on a comp product that would help with some of this, but again, law firms are probably the ones that can be most transparent with you about it, because if they have other tech clients, startup clients, they're the ones that are doing those documents for those clients and can probably walk you through what they see most commonly. But it's, and also talking to your peers, right? Other startup founders, what did they do in those situations? I think the most important part, whether you do a 50-50 split or some other sort of arrangement, is just making sure that you have it documented. Because even if it's your best friend and you say, hey, we're going to split this 50-50, and you shake hands and then you go build the company, if there's a dispute about that down the line and it's not documented somewhere, you don't have any legal ground to stand on unless that's been legally documented and you've actually been issued those shares in the company.
Right. So thanks for that. I'm often asked too, and many people on our team, what great examples exist out there of companies that I should look at to model myself after when it comes to equity. Are you able to provide an example of a successful startup company, either that you worked with or that you're familiar with, that would be a great case study for entrepreneurs to research as it relates to equity?
That's a great question. I don't know if there are any companies out there that have been so a currently private company probably wouldn't be that transparent with their cap table. But it would be an interesting question to ask for a company that's maybe past the private stage of their company's life cycle to go back and document exactly what decision they made at each point in that life cycle. So companies could use that as a model. I don't currently know off the top of my head of any companies that have done that. I know, again, I'm biased because I work at Carta.
Of course.
But our CEO, Henry Ward, has been as transparent, I think, as he can with the decisions he's made. He's published our offer letter, which is how Carta communicates option grants to our new hire employees. A lot of that's on our blog. So, I would recommend folks can go take a look at those resources on Carta's blog. But that's a great question. I think something that Carta may be able to help produce if we have clients that are willing to share that information. Again, I think cap tables are held very close to the company and not typically shared outside of, investors and internal folks at the company. But I do agree with you and the idea that it would be awesome if a company that's gone through it would kind of share that timeline.
And another topic to go in a completely different direction, often when you're thinking about what I'm going to do with this company now and in the future, culture becomes a point of discussion. And unfortunately, sometimes culture is not really defined until you're very much into the launch of the business. And at that point, you're dealing with other kinds of challenges. But if you think about starting a company early stage, and I'm trying to define what my culture is, knowing that your employee is most likely your number one asset. They're the ones that are going to get you to that next level and really contribute towards success. Do you have any feedback or input or evidence that providing equity to employees has an impact positively or negatively on the culture, the climate of the organization?
Yeah, I think that's really hard to pin down and say this is exactly the impact that equity has on employees. But if you talk generally about it, if your employee has a sense of ownership in the company and a vested interest in the company's success, that is going to add to company culture. If the company is successful, we all are successful, and a really material way is going to make employees much more bought into the success of the company. And then that paired with just retention, right? Your vesting schedule is a retention tool. Again, you don't want somebody to come in, take their equity, and then walk out the back door without contributing something to your company. And that's where the vesting schedule comes in.
Sure.
You want that employee to stay for 4 years or longer, and then you add on equity, right? So it's not just the option grant they get on day one. You can add in option grants, a lot of times for engineers or folks at the company that have kind of project-based goals and metrics. You can add option grants on. A single employee can have multiple option grants. They can have a time-based vesting that they got on their hire date that vests over 4 years. And then they can have a second option grant that's milestone-based that they get when they complete a project, like a new product rollout. For a marketing team, it could be a website update, whatever the example is, giving folks those incentives to retain them and make sure they're, finishing projects and staying with the company and they're bought into the success. And also that as the founder, you're sharing that success with your employees, I think is a big culture point as well.
Mm-hmm. And if you think about different types of entrepreneurial models around incubation and acceleration, there are obviously different modules that somebody may learn about. And I'm curious, from your perspective, is there enough content and information generally being distributed in these types of programs, or is there room for improvement? I'm just curious about your view of the landscape in terms of educating entrepreneurs on what they need to know around the subject of equity, and if we're doing a good enough job in the entrepreneurial ecosystem, or should we improve upon that? And if you have ideas on how we could do that, open to that part of the discussion.
Yeah, so Rachel, who's on the line as well, is our head of Accelerator strategy. And so we see that as a really important part of our partner network because Carta is best utilized in the full life cycle of a company. We see our accelerator and incubator partners as helping us get in front of companies from the very first day that that company is even in the ideation stage. I do find, every accelerator is different, and we always offer to give these Equity 101 talks. I do think that some like technical accelerators that are more focused on providing, whether it's like healthcare and life science or robotics or something really technical like that, they're more focused on providing like lab resources and like technical advisors and mentors than they are on some of the business aspects. And it's a really important part, even if you have a super technical startup, to make sure that your business is on solid ground as well. And so we tried to make sure that we're either doing these sorts of Equity 101 webinars or at least providing the content to every accelerator that we partner with to make sure that that information is making it to those founders. Carta ourselves actually has a goal this year to educate 100,000 people in Equity 101. And so every event we do like this helps us towards that goal. And that's how important we think it is to founders and early stage employees.
So I'm curious, Rachel, as the head of Accelerator Development, what you can add to that conversation. I think Kelley did a really great overview. Is there anything else that you'd like to put in there?
Yeah, absolutely. So, what we've seen, we work with many different types of accelerator programs. You have your traditional accelerators with, that 12 to 16 week program with very structured curriculum each week on a different topic. You have your incubators, you have kind of your innovation centers. There's multiple different types of models, but consistently throughout each of those different types of models, we have seen a tremendous interest in these programs wanting to be able to provide their companies with this type of education, the fundraising education, the Equity 101, helping them as founders understand what they need to pass along to their employees and how this all plays out for them, just like everything Kelley touched on. But there's definitely that, right? You get into one of these programs to help your business be successful, to help your company grow. And a key component to that most of the time is, once you finish the program, all right, you're launched, you're going to go continue to build, you're going to fundraise. And usually fundraising is a key component at the end of a lot of these programs. And maintaining a clean cap table is absolutely key and can help your fundraising process go a lot smoother. So we are seeing lots of interest and a very warm welcome to from programs to just help spread this thought leadership and education that we have, and that's what we're trying to do.
And appreciate the mission there. And what I'm finding is the entrepreneurial ecosystem nationally and internationally, it is growing every single day and become much better linked. And entrepreneurs today have access to so many wonderful resources like Carta that just didn't exist not that many years ago. And I know that if we were having this discussion a year ago, we probably would be doing this in person and we have a full audience in front of us and maybe we do some live streaming. Obviously, the world has changed over the last year where it's a completely different set of circumstances and nobody really knows where the future is going, which really brings me to another type of question for you. When we talk about educating and communicating entrepreneurs and having to do this in a virtual environment, and I'm sure this will be a part of our future forevermore, and there'll be some sorts of normalcy that we're also used to and people start to come back together. But are you finding the environment that we're in right now more opportunistic for companies like Carta to be able to engage with entrepreneurs? Is it easier to link, or was it easier when we were pre-COVID, and maybe what does the post-COVID world look like from the Carta perspective? I threw a lot in there, but happy to take it any direction you'd like.
Well, first of all, I am based in Boston and I cover Florida as my territory. So I very much look forward to a time where I can come down to Florida in January do in-person presentations. But from I think there's pros and cons to that, right? When the COVID first hit early last year, Carta looked at what we had initially projected for ourselves over the year. And it was pretty uncertain, I think, for everyone, late stage startups, early stage startups, of what the next few months were going to look like. And for Carta, right, the inbound interest of new companies didn't really slow down. We saw we didn't really see a slowdown in the number of companies. And because we're taking companies at such early stage, it's a really big indicator of, are there companies out there that are being created that need CARTA or not? And they were still there, which kind of signaled to us that these companies were figuring out how to work remote and how to keep going and how to, make progress even when their teams are remote. So I think the pro side of that is when you're looking at a distributed workforce, from the startup perspective, you can hire the best people no matter where they're located. And you don't have now this big overhead cost of office space and location, which can make it a bit easier. I think the flip side of that is startups are, the thing to me that I always find working in partnerships for startup companies is just the community locally that is created around these startups to help them. Whether I'm in Boston or I'm in Florida or I'm in Atlanta or Chicago or DC, right? All of these places have these amazing ecosystems that help startups flourish. And a big part of that is that collaboration. And so I think, at the beginning of last year, there was a challenge of how do we get these founders together? How do we get these resources in front of them when we can't all be in the same place? We can't do networking events. We can't go to conferences. And so that was a bit challenging, but now that we're able to do things like these, we can reach out to more founders and more programs when there's not the logistics behind being there physically. So I've never been a founder myself, and I can't imagine how isolating that probably felt for a lot of folks last year when you're used to, okay, I have this accelerator program and I'm going to go in and there's going to be all these other founders and I'm going to be able to talk to them and ask questions and tell them when I'm stressed out. But being able to find these online communities, I think, has been a really important part of kind of transitioning into our new normal.
Right. And I'm glad that you brought up that last subject about being isolated, because I think self-care management is an area where entrepreneurs are not very focused. They're focused on everything else but themselves. And I think that there's a trend that's starting to occur where you also need to look at yourself so that you can be sane and healthy throughout your entrepreneurial experience. And I know that you're up in Boston, so we welcome you down to South Florida anytime. It's always sunshining down here in South Florida. And Rachel, I know you're on the west coast of the U.S. and you've got great weather all year round, and we'd like to come visit you sometime, but you're always welcome as well. But this is bringing us to the end of our workshop, and I would really like to thank CARTA and our panelists, Rachel and Kelley, for doing such a great job with the workshop today, and we'd love to welcome you back in the future and continue this discussion and other topics as well. I think the key takeaway for me is that no matter what, entrepreneurs are going to make mistakes as a startup. So if you're a founder, they're going to happen. You learn from those mistakes and you recognize them quickly and you make adjustments along the way to ultimately achieve your success. So the word pivot is often used. And how do I pivot? And I think that's probably the second most popular term I've heard in the last year, besides you're on mute. Anyways, I would like to think that it's important to understand that as a startup progresses towards an exit, the founders and the key team members require enough shares to remain motivated to move the company forward. I thank you so much again. We look forward to future collaboration with CARTA. And as a reminder, the Alan B. Levan NSU Broward Center of Innovation will physically open this summer, but in the meantime, we are offering scheduled virtual events on a weekly or bi-weekly basis. You can view our calendar by visiting our webpage at nova.edu/innovation. You can also email us at innovation@nova.edu. And then if you're calling within the US, our direct line is 954-262 Tech. That's TECH. Don't forget to check us out on LinkedIn, Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. Thank you for joining us today. Stay safe and healthy. Again, thank you, our panelists, and this will conclude today's workshop. Thank you.
Thanks, John.
On LinkedIn, Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. Thank you for joining us today. Stay safe and healthy. Again, thank you, our panelists, and this will conclude today's workshop. Thank you.
Thanks, John.
On LinkedIn, Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. Thank you for joining us today. Stay safe and healthy. Again, thank you, our panelists, and this will conclude today's workshop. Thank you.